All right, let's go. Number 10, maygrass. There is a tray in a museum collection that holds several hundred seeds, and the whole tray would sit in a cupped hand. Each seed is under 2.5 millimeters long, about the size of a pinhead. They are flattened and glossy, the color of dark honey, where charring has not taken them all the way to black. They came out of dry rock shelters in the Ozarks and out of caves in Kentucky. For roughly 3,000 years, they were a crop. The plant is Phalaris caroliniana maygrass, a small annual grass with a dense cylindrical seed head. It still grows across the southern half of North America and into northern Mexico, thickest in the southeast. Nobody plants it. Nobody eats it. Where it grows now, it is a ditchweed almost nobody can name. The archaeology says something else entirely. Maygrass turns up at sites from Alabama, north into Illinois, and southwestern Indiana, hundreds of kilometers beyond the northern edge of its natural range. It cannot get there on its own. A winter annual that sprouts in autumn and ripens in May does not walk north into a climate that kills it. Somebody carried. The seed sowed it and did it again the next year and the year after that for an extraordinary length of time. At Bacon Bend in the lower Tennessee River Valley, one deposit produced 130 charred maygrass seeds at around 2400 BC. In the Ozark Bluff shelters, whole clumps of seed heads were stored and set aside, which is what people do with grain they intend to plant. In Salt's Cave and Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the seeds turn up inside preserved human feces, so there is no argument about what happened to them. What makes maygrass worth a place on this list is its timing. It ripens in May and June ahead of every other crop in the eastern system. It comes ready in the gap between the last stored food and the first summer harvest. That is the hungriest stretch of the year. The seed is high in protein, and it arrives precisely when a farming community has run out of everything else. Here is the problem the plant creates for the people who study it. Domesticated plants normally announce themselves. Seeds get larger, coats get thinner. Shapes change, and the change can be measured under a microscope. Maygrass never did any of it. Across thousands of years of archaeological collections, the seeds do not change, and there is no unequivocal morphological evidence that the plant was ever domesticated at all. So the case rests on geography and behavior instead. It sits in places it cannot reach. It is stored in bundles. It appears in quantities that do not gather by accident. At Cahokia and at Mississippian settlements far from the river valleys, it turns up in contexts suggesting it mattered as more than calories closer to a marker of who people were. Then it goes. Maygrass falls away sharply in the early Mississippian period as maize takes the fields. The plant did not fail. The relationship ended. Be exact about what died here, because it governs everything that follows. The species is still alive. What is extinct is the crop, the sown plots, the stored bundles, the harvest calendar, and 3,000 years of knowing when to walk out and cut it. Not one cultivated population survives anywhere on Earth. We cannot rebuild one because nobody wrote the instructions down. The seeds in the tray are the last physical trace we have of it. They are the same size and shape as the seeds on any Arkansas roadside. This spring, which is exactly the difficulty. Held in the hand, there is nothing to see. Everything that made them food was carried in the people who grew them. Number 9. The wheat that had no name. In 2003, archaeobotanists working on plant remains from Neolithic and Bronze Age sites in northern Greece published a description of something they could not identify. Glynis Jones, Sultana Maria Valamotti, and Michael Charles were examining charred gloom bases and spikelet forks. The tough chaff left behind when a hulled wheat is threshed and thrown on a fire. The material did not match einkorn. It did not match emmer. It did not match spelt. They had no name for it. So they described its anatomy in detail and called it New Gloom Wheat, and that placeholder held for the next 20 years. Once there was a description, the thing began appearing everywhere. Archaeobotanists across Europe went back through their own material and recognized chaff they had been filing as damaged emmer for decades. A survey published in 2023 pulled the finds together. It counted 89 prehistoric sites across southeastern and eastern Europe. Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Moldova. They run from the late 7th millennium BC to the last centuries BC. That is more than 5,000 years of continuous cultivation across a continent of a cereal nobody alive has eaten, and that we could not name. It was not a minor crop either. At Catalhoyuk in central Anatolia, one of the largest Neolithic settlements on Earth, it sits alongside einkorn and emmer in the diet. Tina Rushanifus, Amy Bogard, and Michael Charles worked through the material there. Their conclusion was that this was a domesticated crop in its own right, not a weed of somebody else's harvest. But here is where it stops being a footnote in a chaff report. In 2020, a team including Alexandra Tchaikovska ran ancient DNA typing on archaeological grains from across the range. New Gloom wheat came back as a cultivated member of the Triticum timofeevi group, a tetraploid wheat domesticated in Southwest Asia by the middle of the 9th millennium BC. It was not a stray variant of a familiar species. It was a separate line of wheat. It was taken into cultivation at the very beginning of farming, carried west with einkorn and emmer and grown from Anatolia to Hungary for 50 centuries. For most of the history of European farming, one of the staples on the table was a plant we could not name until 6 years ago. Then the record simply stops. There is no archaeological evidence for it after the final centuries BC, in a period when Roman agricultural reorganization was pushing free-threshing high-yield wheats across the same fields. A hulled wheat has to be pounded out of its glooms before it can be milled, which costs labor, and labor is what kills a crop in a market economy. The advantages run the other way, and they are real. Grain locked in its husk stores better. It resists insects and fungus and will sit in a pit through a bad winter. None of that shows up in a tax assessment, except that it is not quite gone. In western Georgia, in the valleys below the Caucasus, farmers still sow a mixed landrace called Zanduri, and one of the wheats in that mixture is Triticum timofeevi. It survived there because the fields were small, remote, and stubborn. Soviet agricultural policy nearly finished the job, and cultivation has only been partly rebuilt since the 2000s. The plant carries strong resistance to rusts and mildews. That is now the main reason anyone outside Georgia is interested in it. Breeders have been crossing that resistance into modern bred wheat for decades, mostly without knowing where it came from. So the unsettling part is not that a founder crop was lost. It is that it was never quite lost at all. A wheat that fed Neolithic Europe for 5,000 years is still standing in a handful of Georgian fields in an unbroken line. The plant did not end. We did. Number 8. Sumpweed. Excavators working the dry bluff shelters of the Arkansas Ozarks in the 1920s and 1930s kept pulling out seeds that were the wrong size. They were teardrop-shaped achenes, dark and hard, and they belonged to a common river bottom weed called Eva annua marsh elder or sumpweed. The problem was the dimensions. Wild sumpweed achenes are rarely longer than 4 millimeters. These ran from 4 to 10 millimeters long and up to 6.5 across. And at some sites the average was over 7. That is a plant roughly doubled in the part people eat, and no wild population on Earth produces it. Nothing in the species does that by itself. Sumpweed is not a glamorous ancestor. It grows on floodplains and broken mud. It is wind-pollinated, and it belongs to the same corner of the daisy family as ragweed, which is to say that a field of it in flower is a hay fever event. Nobody would look at it twice. But the seed inside the shell is dense with protein and oil, and it carries calcium, iron, phosphorus, potassium, thiamine, and niacin at levels that make it a serious food comparable to the staples we grow now. The chronology is tight, and it is anchored by direct dating. An accelerator date from Napoleon Hollow in Illinois shows the size increase already underway by 2000 BC. By 1000 BC, sumpweed is being stored alongside other seeds, obviously kept back for sowing. At Newtcache Hollow in Kentucky, the large-seeded form turns up in preserved human feces, which closes the last gap in the argument. These were not curiosities. People were farming them and eating them. And they went on, doing it for something close to 3,000 years. Processing was work. The shell has to come off before the oily kernel is any use, and at these sizes that means grinding and winnowing in bulk rather than cracking seeds one at a time. Somebody built that step into the year, every year, for 100 generations. Seed size is the clearest signal in the whole discipline. Sow a handful into broken ground, and the largest seeds throw the biggest seedlings, which win the race for light, which means their offspring go back into the bag at harvest. Do that for 20 generations, and the population shifts. Do it for 1,000 years, and the plant no longer resembles its own ancestors. And a plant changed that far cannot go home. A 7mm akin is expensive to build. In a wild floodplain, competing against everything else in the mud, a plant that pours its resources into a few enormous seeds is beaten flat by a plant that makes hundreds of small ones. The giant form existed because it was planted, weeded, and harvested. Remove the gardener, and it is not a superior plant at all. What it becomes is a liability with a brutal deadline. That is roughly what happened, and it does not look like a catastrophe. Sumpweed declines after maize agriculture intensifies around AD 1000 to 1200, and production falls away after AD 1200. It looks like a change of mind spread over generations, in which a labor-intensive oilseed lost to a grain that returned more calories for less work. Set it beside the sunflower, and the loss sharpens. Same region, same era, same farmers. Helianthus annuus was domesticated in eastern North America out of a native weed, and it now feeds us from millions of hectares between Ukraine and Argentina. Sumpweed went through the identical process in the identical fields and ended in a drawer. Iva annua, variety Macrocarpa. The domesticated form does not exist. It is not rare. It is not hiding in an unsurveyed bottomland. Every sumpweed alive today makes seeds under 4 millimeters long. And the disturbing thing about that number is how fast 1,000 years of selection can be handed back. What is left is trays. Oversized black achenias in university collections, cataloged by site and level each one, from a plant that only ever grew because somebody put it in the ground. The floodplain gardens are gone, and so are the gardeners. The weed is still out on the mudflats every summer, flowering, making people sneeze 3 millimeters long. Number 7. The gourds the mastodons carried. Wet sites in North America have preserved mastodon dung, and inside some of those deposits, among crushed twigs and conifer needles, are the seeds of wild gourds. They are intact. They passed through an animal the size of a lorry and came out the other end ready to grow. That single fact is the beginning of the strangest survival story in our food supply. Wild cucurbita, the genus behind every squash pumpkin marrow and courgette, is not edible. The flesh is loaded with cucurbitacins, bitter triterpenoid compounds the plant makes to stop animals eating it. They work. In modern cases of accidental cucurbitacin poisoning, people report severe symptoms after 1 or 2 mouthfuls, and the taste is so violent that most never get that far. A wild gourd is a hard, yellow ball of poison hanging on a vine. There is a modern version of this, and it has a name. Toxic squash syndrome turns up when a cultivated plant reverts and throws one fruit with the old chemistry back inside it. People who eat it end up in hospital with violent vomiting, and in the worst reported cases, their hair falls out weeks later. The chemistry is not gone. It is switched off, and it remembers. What makes the bitterness matter is who could taste it. In 2015, Logan Kistler, Lee Newsom, Timothy Ryan, Andrew Clark, Bruce Smith, and George Perry published an analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences comparing bitter taste receptor genes across 38 mammal genomes. The pattern is clean. Small mammals carry many working bitter receptors because a mouse that eats the wrong thing dies of it. Very large herbivores carry fewer because a mastodon can absorb a dose that would kill a squirrel 1,000 times over. So the gourd was not poisonous to everything. It was poisonous to everything small. Its bitterness was a filter that admitted exactly one class of animal, and that animal swallowed the fruit whole, walked for kilometers, and deposited the seeds in a heap of fertilizer. It is a terrifying strategy to be caught holding when the filter empties. And then the animals that could eat them died. At the end of the Pleistocene, the American megafauna went, and the gourds lost two things at once. They lost the only mouths that would carry their seed anywhere. They also lost the churned, trampled open ground that big herbivores maintain as closing forest, and settling vegetation squeezed out the weedy habitat the vines needed. A plant left holding fruit that nothing will eat in a landscape filling in around it is a plant on a countdown. The genetics show how close it came. The same team sequenced 91 complete plastid genomes, 19 of them ancient. Cucurbita pepo subspecies, pepo the line behind pumpkins, and most summer squashes shows up in 7. Archaeological samples spread over more than 2,000 kilometers and reaching back nearly 10,000 years. No wild form of it is known anywhere today, which leaves us holding the crop and nothing behind it. Other wild relatives survive only as isolated remnant patches around the Gulf, separated by almost nothing genetically, which is the signature of a range that shattered recently. The reversal is the part worth holding on to. Nobody rescued these plants out of sentiment. People wanted the seeds, which are oily, nutritious, and not bitter at all, and they wanted the hard rind for bowls and floats. In doing that, we became the replacement disperser, and our gardens became the replacement broken ground. Only once cultivated vines were held apart from wild ones could selection strip out the cucurbitacins and turn a poison ball into a vegetable. The boundary has to be stated plainly, because the chain runs through a contested link. Why the American megafauna died is still argued, and human hunting is one candidate among several, including rapid climate change. What is not in dispute is the outcome for the plant. So the squash in a kitchen right now is a refugee. Its lineage lost its world, attached itself to ours, and came through the bottleneck in a form that cannot survive without being planted. There is no wild version left to go back to. What we eat is the branch that agreed to be eaten. Number 6. Erect knotweed. Every summer since 2014, in plots and gardens around St. Louis, an archaeologist named Natalie Muller has been growing a weed on purpose. It is Polygonum erectum erect knotweed, a sprawling, jointed, unremarkable plant of yards, paths, and field edges across eastern North America. She works at Washington University, and she grows it because it was once a crop, and because she is trying to work out how it was made and why it cannot be made again. Erect knotweed does something clever with its seed. The plant is a bet hedger. It produces 2 different fruit types on the same stem. Smooth achenes with a thin cover that germinate the following spring, and tubercled achenes with a rough, thickened coat that sit dormant in the soil for years. If a season is ruined, the buried half of the crop is still waiting. It is an insurance policy written into the seed coat, and it is the reason a plant this fragile survives in a landscape of floods and droughts. The seed is a small, dark, 3-cornered achene, and once the coat is off, it behaves much like buckwheat, a close relation. It can be boiled whole or ground into flour. Nothing about eating it is difficult, and nothing about growing it is either. Muller measured what that insurance is worth. In growth experiments across 2014 to 2016, the smooth morphs reached 60 to 100% germination after a cold winter. The tubercled morphs managed naught to 35%. One half of the seed crop wakes up on schedule. The other half stays underground and keeps the population alive through disasters that have not happened yet. Now, compare the archaeological seeds. The domesticated form named Polygonum erectum subspecies watsoniae is different in 3 ways at once. The achenes are significantly larger by length, width, and area. The pericarp, the fruit coat, is thinner and carries fewer germination inhibitors. And the 2-morph strategy has collapsed almost entirely, leaving a nearly uniform population of smooth, quick-germinating seed. The plant gave up its ability to wait. It is the single most revealing thing in the assemblage. That is not a small change. A wild knotweed hedges because the world is unpredictable. A farmed knotweed does not need to, because a person is now supplying the predictability, clearing ground, sowing at the right moment, keeping competitors down, holding seed back over winter. The crop traded its own insurance policy for a relationship. Once that trade is understood, the ending stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like arithmetic. The dates are firm. Cultivation begins around 1900 BC. Domesticated morphology appears several centuries later, and a directly dated assemblage from the Whitney Bluff rock shelter in Benton County, Arkansas, falls between about AD 1050 and AD 1220. There is more from Hill Creek in the lower Illinois Valley. Late Mississippian farmers were still growing this, while maize took over the continent around them. The truly unsettling part is that it worked. In 2019, Mueller with Andrea White and Peter Silagi published yields from experimental plots. Grown together as a polyculture goosefoot and erect knotweed outproduced either alone. The combined yield beat global averages for quinoa and buckwheat and sat inside the range of traditionally cultivated maize. This was not a marginal famine food that people escaped from at the first opportunity. It was a productive system tuned over 2,000 years, and it was put down. Maize did not out-argue the system. It outscheduled it. A storable grain that travels in the cob and can be counted, taxed, and moved beats a mixed garden of small-seeded natives every time the accounting is done by somebody other than the gardener. We know the yields now. We do not know the recipes, and it cannot be picked up again. Mueller can grow wild, erect knotweed because wild erect knotweed is coming up through pavement cracks from Missouri to Ohio right now. What she cannot grow is subspecies watsonii because there is none. We have the whole history of the plant and none of its seed. Every seed of it in existence is carbonized or desiccated in a rock shelter or mounted under a museum microscope. The plants that could have restarted the crop were eaten, and their descendants were eaten until one season nobody kept any back. Number 5. The agaves that cannot make seed. On the terraces and stony slopes of central Arizona, there are fields that do not look like fields. They are grids of low rock piles, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, spread across hillsides above the Salt and Verde rivers. Beside them sit roasting pits full of fire-cracked stone, and through the surrounding sites are flat, tabular stone knives with worn, rounded edges. The Hohokam built these between about AD 500 and AD 1450, and the Sinagua and the Ancestral Pueblo built their own versions. They are agave farms, and they are on ground too dry and too steep to grow anything else. And in some of them, the agaves are still there, not descendants of the crop. The crop. Since the 1980s, Wendy Hodgson and Andrew Saliwan at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, later joined by Jane Rosenthal, have been walking those slopes with archaeologists and with indigenous communities, identifying agaves that match nothing wild. 6 have now been described as pre-contact domesticates. Agave murphaei is known from 89 clones and populations. Agave de la Materie from 180. Agave phillipsiana from 92. Agave verdensis from 133, Agave yavapayensis from 43, and Agave sanpedroensis from 16. Every one of them sits on or beside archaeological features, not near them in a loose, suggestive sense. On the rock piles along the terrace lines inside the field systems, the plants themselves carry the marks of selection. The leaves cut easily. The marginal teeth are small and turned down, which matters if the job is stripping a 2-meter rosette by hand before the heat comes up. The hearts are a manageable size for one person to carry. These are the traits a farmer selects for when the harvest means severing a plant at the base and hauling it to a pit, and they are not the traits a desert selects for. Then there is the reproduction, which is the extraordinary part. Most of these agaves set few or no viable seeds, and Agave sanpedroensis produces no fruit at all. They persist by cloning, throwing offsets from the base, and sometimes bulbils from the flower stalk, so that one plant becomes a slowly widening ring of identical plants. In the strict sense, what is standing on those terraces is the same individual continuing sideways through 6 centuries. A crop that has not had a new generation since before Europeans reached the continent. The food was the heart. Cut the leaves away, and what remains is a pale carbohydrate mass, the size of a football packed with fructans that human digestion cannot use. Bake it in a stone-lined pit for a day or two, and the fructans break down into simple sugars, and it becomes one of the most calorie-dense foods available in that landscape. The emerging flower stalk was taken the same way. The technique is old across the Americas, thousands of years older than these particular fields. Agave asks almost nothing in return. It needs no irrigation. It tolerates the frosts at these elevations, and it can be left standing for years until a household needs it. That makes it a living store rather than a harvest, which is exactly the right property on ground that gets no reliable rain. Set out what that means. A crop was selected until it could no longer reproduce sexually, which was not a problem because people were propagating it by hand. Then the people stopped. The field systems emptied, the roasting pits went cold, and the plants were left holding a strategy that only works if somebody is planting the offsets. That is a haunting position for a living thing to be left in. There is a second reason the Desert Botanical Garden keeps working on them, and it belongs to us rather than to the Hohokam. A crop bred to feed people on bare rock in a warming desert with no water is not a museum curiosity. It is a short list. They are still holding it. Ring after ring of sterile clones flowering into the desert air above the outlines of fields. Nobody has worked since the 15th century. The plants survived. What did not survive is everything else. Which agave went into which field when it was cut, how long it was baked, what it was called, and who was allowed to eat it. Their farmers left us a living crop and took the entire manual with them. Number 4. The goosefoot that lost its shell. The measurement that identifies this plant is taken in microns, and it is a measurement of armor. Chenopodium berlandieri. A pit seed goosefoot is a scruffy annual of broken ground across most of North America. It makes enormous numbers of tiny black seeds, each wrapped in a hard outer coat called the testa. In wild populations, that coat averages more than 40 microns. It is the reason the seed can lie in soil for years and still come up waterproof, tough slow, to give in. Goosefoot is not a difficult food. The seeds boil into a porridge or grind into flour, and the young leaves are edible as greens, which is why the plant follows human settlement everywhere it goes. A single stand throws out tens of thousands of seeds. On a river terrace, it is a granary that plants itself. Now take the archaeological material. At Newt Cache in Kentucky, the mean testa thickness is 15.8 microns. At Russell Cave in Alabama, it is 11.3. At Ash Cave in Ohio, 14.9. Modern domesticated relatives sit between 16 and 19. That is armor, cut to a quarter of its thickness. It is not a gradient across the wild range. It is a break. In 1985, Bruce Smith and Vicky Funk gave the thin-coated form its own name. Chenopodium berlandieri, subspecies Jonasianum. Alongside the reduced testa, the fruit margins change from rounded to truncate, so the seeds sit flatter, and the whole package moves in a direction no wild population goes. The earliest thin-coated seeds come from Newt Cache at about 1500 BC. Salt's Cave in Kentucky gives 600 BC. Russell Cave gives around 390 BC, and Ash Cave around AD 230. This is a crop with a run of 2,000 years and more. The problem is what a thin coat costs. Reduce the testa, and the seed germinates fast and evenly, which is what a farmer wants from a sown plot. And it cooks quickly and grinds easily, which is what a cook wants. It is a better food in every direction. It is also a seed that cannot survive being ignored for a single season. It rots, it is eaten, it comes up at the wrong time, and it has no reserve of dormant sisters underground to cover the mistake. Nobody was trying to build a fragile plant. They were trying to build a reliable one. And in a sown field, those are the same thing. The seeds were held back over winter for 100 generations, and every one of those winters selected against dormancy. It is a frightening piece of engineering because there is no redundancy left in it. That is the bargain running underneath all of these plants, and it is worth saying once clearly. Domestication is not improvement. It is the transfer of a plant's survival from the plant to us. Every trait that makes a crop good to eat is a trait that makes it worse at living alone. For a long time, there was a rival explanation, and it deserves stating fairly. Domesticated chenopod's exist in Mexico, and the obvious reading was that the eastern crop was an import carried north like maize. In 2011, Logan Kistler and Beth Shapiro settled it in the Journal of Archaeological Science. They pulled chloroplast DNA out of ancient seeds from 3 rock shelters: Cloud Splitter in Kentucky at around 1800 BC, Haystack in Kentucky between AD 400 and 700, and Holman in Arkansas at about AD 1100. Every ancient sample carried the eastern haplotype matching wild chenopod's of eastern North America. Nobody brought this crop in. It was built where it was found out of the local weed by the people who lived there. Caches of the domesticated seed have since turned up as far north as southern Ontario. Then, maize agriculture spread through the same river valleys from around AD 900, and the eastern chenopod thins out of the record and stops. Subspecies Jonesianum has no living population anywhere. The wild goosefoot it was bred from is everywhere, untroubled 40 microns thick. The disturbing symmetry only shows up when you look south. In the Andes, different people took a different chenopodium and domesticated it into quinoa, and quinoa is now farmed on 5 continents and sold in every supermarket in the rich world. The same genus, the same idea, roughly the same era. One of those crops feeds millions of us. The other survives as a number in a table 15.8 microns, Newtcache, Kentucky. Number 3. The palm of Rapa Nui. Cut into the weathered volcanic rock of Rapa Nui, the island most of the world calls Easter Island are tubes. They are 5 to 7 millimeters across. They branch, and some of them run more than 10 meters down into the bedrock. They are molds left where the roots of an enormous palm rotted away and the soil closed in behind them. Andreas Mieth and Hans Rudolf Bork logged more than 6,000 meters of soil profile across 117 square kilometers of it. From the density of root molds and buried stumps, they estimated that some 16 million palms once stood there, covering around 70% of the surface. Other reconstructions push that towards 20 million and 80%. Either way, the bare grassland in every photograph of the Moai is not the island. It is what is left of the island. Nobody has ever seen the tree. Not one botanist in the whole history of the science. What survives of the palm is fragments, pollen in the crater, lake sediments, casts of the root bosses in the rock, endocarps, the woody shells of the nuts recovered from caves. In 1984, John Dransfield and colleagues published them in Nature with a radiocarbon age of 820 years, plus or minus 40. The nuts are 2 to 3 centimeters across, like small coconuts. The nearest living relative appears to be Jubaiya chilensis, the Chilean wine palm, whose trunk can exceed a meter across. The extinct form was later given its own genus and species Pascalococos disperta, partly to stop people assuming they knew what it was. Whether it was ever truly distinct from Jubaiya is still open. But here is where the island stops being a parable and starts being evidence. Dransfield noted that every endocarp recovered from those caves had been gnawed by rodents. The Polynesian rat arrived with the first settlers, as it did on every Pacific island, and it eats palm seed. That observation grew into a full argument pressed hardest by Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, that rats, rather than people, emptied the forest. It is a serious case, and it removes the moral from the story, which is part of why it spread. Except that the nuts in the burn layers say something else. Mieth and Bork examined over 200 charred nutshells from burned soil horizons and found rat tooth marks on fewer than 10% against every specimen from the caves. The cave nuts were a rat larder. The nuts in the fires were being handled by people. Alongside them are burned palm stumps cut cleanly a few centimeters above the old ground surface and charcoal layers running across tens of thousands of square meters on the Poik Peninsula and in the southwest. The felling and burning dates to roughly AD 1250 to 1500, and the whole destruction took no more than 3 or 4 centuries. Their conclusion is blunt. People, not rats, were the dominant destroyers of the woodland. The fuller picture is messier than either version. Working through the pollen records Valenti Roll found, the clearance was not one event. At Rano Raraku, it starts around 450 BC and grinds on for 2,000 years. At Rano Kau, it runs from about AD 50 to AD 1600. At Rano Arroy, it is abrupt, a single century between about 1520 and 1600. Drought during the medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age dried the woodland and made it burn. Humans, rats, and climate all pulled the same way. What people took was direct. The nuts, which is why they are charred in cooking layers. The heart, which kills a mature tree to feed one household for an evening. That is brutal arithmetic on an island with no other forest. The trunks went for canoes and shelter, and the ground underneath went to something that produced faster. So the residue is this: a cave floor of gnawed shells. A hillside of hollow root molds 10 meters deep in rock still holding shape 600 years on. And a tree that once stood in the millions on one island which left behind no wood, no leaf, no flower, and no certainty about what species it even was. That is an extraordinary way for something so large to go. The statues are still there. The forest that stood over them is a pattern of holes in the ground. Number 2. The bean with no living ancestor. At El Wad Terrace, on the western slope of Mount Carmel in northern Israel, excavators working early Natufian deposits recovered 6 charred legumes. They are medium-sized, roughly 5 millimeters long, and they came out of layers laid down between about 15,000 and 13,500 years ago. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers who had begun living in one place, building in stone, and burying their dead at home. Nobody on Earth farmed anything yet. One of the seeds was a radiocarbon, dated twice, returning 12,145 and 12,131 years before present, which averages to a calibrated range of 14,150 to 13,900 years ago. Valentina Caracuda and her colleagues then put 3 specimens through X-ray microcomputed tomography and looked at the internal anatomy, an elongated radical, and oblong hilum. Those 2 features together identify the genus and the species. The seeds are Vicia faba, the broad bean. They published in Scientific Reports in 2016, and the result sits roughly 3,000 years ahead of the earliest domesticated broad beans. These were wild beans gathered by people who did not plant anything. The founder package of Southwest Asian farming is 8 species, 3 cereals, 4 pulses, and flax. The broad bean is not on that list. It is domesticated in the same region at roughly the same time, and it becomes one of the great protein crops of the ancient Mediterranean. Pulses are what made the whole package work. Cereal on its own is short of the amino acids our bodies cannot build, and beans supply them, which is why nearly every early farming system on Earth pairs a grain with a legume. Wheat and lentils, rice and dal, maize and beans. What makes this find extraordinary is what it has to be compared against. Vicia faba has no known wild progenitor. Every broad bean on Earth today, in every field allotment and seed bank, is a domesticated plant. No wild population of the species has ever been located, and neither has any wild species close enough to be its ancestor. Take a moment on how strange that is. Those 8 founder crops all have living, wild relatives you can go and look at. Wild einkorn grows in Turkey. Wild emmer grows on the basalt slopes of the Galilee. Wild barley is a common roadside plant across the region. Wild lentil, wild pea, and wild chickpea are all there, all findable, all sequenced. The broad bean stands alone. It is the one early crop of that region whose parent has vanished, and the caramel seeds are the closest thing we have to a photograph of it. They came out of food waste. The last securely identified wild broad beans in the world are rubbish in a Natufian camp. The honest boundary is that absence of evidence is not extinction. Botanists have refound supposedly vanished plants before, and the eastern Mediterranean has been surveyed hard, but not exhaustively. There is a version of this where a wild faba turns up in an unplowed corner of Anatolia or the Zagros next decade. What can be said now is narrower and still remarkable. Something grew in the Galilee. At the end of the Ice Age, people ate it for 4,000 years. They domesticated it around 10,200 years ago. And after that, the wild form is never seen again. Why it went is not recoverable. Grazing plowing a warming climate competition from its own domesticated descendants 4 millennia of steady gathering or all of that together. The mechanism is lost with the plant, and that is the unsettling part of a disappearance this complete. The consequence is not lost, and it is why this sits at number 2. The wild relatives of crops are the only reservoir breeders have for the traits domestication threw away, and they are drawn on constantly rust resistance in wheat drought and salt tolerance, disease resistance in potatoes and rice. When a wild relative disappears, the options inside that species close permanently. The broad bean is the case where it already happened, and the door shut before anyone knew there was a door. It is still happening. Wild crop relatives across Southwest Asia are being lost to grazing urban expansion and warming faster than they are collected, and the gene banks hold a fraction of them. Something is quietly eating the ancestors of our food. It has our habits, and it keeps our hours. Number 1, silphium. On the coins of Cyrene, struck from the 6th century BC onward, there is a plant, a thick root, a ribbed stalk, a spreading head of flowers, drawn with the care a mint reserves for the thing its city is rich because of. On some coins, the fruit appears alone, a flattened seed with a notched top and a point at the bottom. The city put it on the money, because the city was the money. Silphium grew in a narrow band of the Cyrenaican steppe in what is now eastern Libya, roughly 200 kilometers by 55. Herodotus described its range as running from the island of Plateo to the mouth of the Syrtis. Outside that strip, it did not grow, not for want of trying. Theophrastus in the 4th century BC gives a description careful enough to still be useful. Thick roots in black bark, about a cubit long, a hollow stalk, like fennel, golden foliage, like celery. He also records that it could not be cultivated. 2 attempts to transplant it to mainland Greece, reported in the Hippocratic tradition, failed. An entire economy was built on wild harvesting. The valuable part was the resin, tapped from root and stalk, known in Latin as laser. It went into food as a seasoning, and into medicine for stomach pain, warts, hair loss, toothache, and epilepsy. And it was widely believed to work as a contraceptive. The prices sound invented. Julius Caesar registered 1,500 pounds of laser in the Roman treasury, stored alongside the gold. Ancient sources put the plant's value against silver by weight. There is one image that may show the trade running. The Archaeology cup, a Laconian kylix made around 565 BC, and now in Paris shows King Archelaus II of Cyrene under an awning watching 7 labeled workers pack, weigh, and stack cargo. Whether that cargo is silphium or wool has been argued for a century and is unresolved. Then, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, gives the ending in a sentence. Within his lifetime, 1 stalk had been found in Cyrenaica, and it was sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. The truly unsettling part of Pliny's account is how ordinary it is. He is not recording a catastrophe. He is writing a note about supply in a book full of notes about supply, and he blames the tax farmers who leased the grazing land for driving the flocks too hard. 7 centuries separate the founding of Cyrene around 638 BC from that last stalk. That is the whole life of the trade in a coastal strip the size of an English county. Why it ended is still argued, and the argument matters. Overgrazing and overharvesting have been the standard answer for a long time, and the sources support it, since the animals ate the plant and the herders had every reason to let them. Recent work puts the weight on desertification, instead arguing the Cyrenaican steppe dried underneath the plant whatever anyone did. The defensible reading takes both. A species confined to one narrow habitat, refusing cultivation and slow to mature, carried no margin when a drying climate and a hard-worked landscape arrived together. And there is a coda nobody expected. In 1983, a young Turkish researcher named Mahmut Miski working on the genus Ferula was taken by villagers to the slopes of Mount Hassan in Cappadocia to see some unusually tall plants. They were Ferula drudeana. He collected them and moved on. He came back to them nearly 30 years later. The resemblances are not trivial. Opposite leaves, which the rival candidates lack. Thick branching roots. Papery fruits shaped like inverted hearts. After the April rains, it throws up close to 2 meters of stalk in a month. Chemical work on the roots has pulled out around 30 secondary metabolites. In 2021, the food historian Sally Granger cooked Roman recipes with it against the same dishes made with asafoetida, the substitute Rome fell back on. The asafoetida versions were left on the plate. The objection is geography. Mount Hassan is roughly 1,300 kilometers from Cyrene across the sea, and every ancient source insists silphium came from Cyrenaica and nowhere else. Other candidates have been proposed, including Ferula tingitana and Cacris ferulacea, and the historian Alan Tuwaide is skeptical. The only test that settles it is a securely identified ancient sample, and none has been found. Ferula drudeana is meanwhile down to about 600 plants, half wild and half in botanical gardens. So the last of silphium is its portrait stamped in silver in coin trays across Europe. Thousands of people handled those coins over 2,500 years, and every one of them knew what the picture meant until the point where nobody did. The plant on the money is one nobody has tasted in 19 centuries, and no botanist can be certain of naming. This is often called the first extinction recorded in writing, and that is worth holding loosely because plenty of things went before anyone thought to write them down. The record survives only because what died happened to be expensive. But strip the claim back, and something exact remains, and it is the shape every entry on this list has taken. A species existed in one place. It was wanted more than it could grow. And the end of it reached us not as a mystery or a disaster, but as an administrative note about one surviving stalk cut, carried across the sea and handed to an emperor as a novelty. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe